At 3 a.m., the Vatican isn't quiet, it's cautious. Not asleep. Not peaceful. Just still in the way a place gets when it senses a door is about to open that should have stayed shut. Monsignor Dario Vigano walked the corridor toward the Holy Father's chambers with a folder held tight against his chest, like he could physically restrain what was inside. It wasn't a schedule change or a ceremonial note. It was a statement with teeth, language that didn't merely clarify doctrine but threatened to rearrange loyalties that had held for centuries. Vigano had served Pope Leo XIV for only 6 months, long enough to learn the difference between ordinary pressure and the kind that bends history. Tonight was the second kind. He had seen Leo pray through crises, counsel leaders, and absorb the daily burdens of Rome without flinching. But earlier, when the Pope spoke, there was a composure in him that felt almost severe, like peace after a verdict. Leo's voice had barely risen above a whisper, yet the words landed like a gavel. The Church has been preaching a false redemption. Tomorrow, we will correct this. If you're listening to this like a story, it's easy to imagine the controversy as a headline waiting to happen. But inside those walls, it felt closer to a controlled detonation, carefully placed, precisely timed, and impossible to take back. Quick moment, if you love Pope Leo XIV, click the subscribe button now. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and share your thoughts. Outside, an early November dawn began to spill over Rome. Light slid across the columns of St. Peter's Square in bands of golden shadow, as if the city itself couldn't decide whether it was witnessing a blessing or a warning. Below, pilgrims gathered with ordinary hopes, prayers for healing, forgiveness, a safer future, unaware that above them, their shepherd was preparing to challenge the most comfortable version of salvation the modern church had learned to sell. And the truth is, Leo didn't arrive at this moment overnight. This wasn't a rebellion. It was an accumulation, decades of seeing the world bleed while religion stayed tidy. To understand why he chose those words, why he was willing to be called heretic by some and prophet by others, we have to go back before Rome, back to the places that formed him long before he ever stood at an apostolic window. He wasn't born into marble. Long before the white cassock and the balcony, Leo was simply Father Leon to people who did not have the luxury of arguing theology in comfortable rooms. In Peru, the church didn't feel like an institution. It felt like a thin roof in the rain, something people clung to because there was nothing else. The parish sat where the paved road gave up, on the outskirts of a city that kept expanding without ever really arriving. The dust was fine as flour and it found its way into everything, the folds of clothing, the corners of mouths, the pages of hymnals. Children played soccer with balls made from taped rags. Women carried water like it was the day's first prayer. Men left before sunrise for work that might not exist by noon. And Leo, then a younger priest with sunburned forearms and an accent softened by years of listening, learned quickly that peace be with you could sound cruel if you didn't mean it with your hands. He would walk the alleys after Mass, not as a tour of suffering, but because people needed more than a blessing at the doorway. He learned names. He learned the private geography of desperation, which houses had medicine, which ones had none, which mothers smiled in public and cried when the children slept, which men were holding rage like a lit match because they had no other way to feel powerful. One afternoon, a boy no older than 10 ran up to him outside the chapel, breathless, eyes wide with the kind of fear that doesn't belong in a child. The boy grabbed his sleeve and tugged him toward a shack behind a row of cinder blocks. Inside, an old man lay on a mattress that had gone flat years ago. His ribs rose and fell like a weak tide. The air smelled of damp cloth and old cooking oil. Leo knelt beside him, asked what hurt, asked where the pain lived. The old man didn't answer the question. He looked at Leo's collar and whispered, almost politely, "Padre, when you say God saves us, where does that happen?" It was not a trick. It was not a challenge. It was a sincere request for coordinates. Where does salvation touch the body that has worked itself into bone? Leo felt something in him tighten, not against God, but against the easy way people spoke about God. He heard, in that single question, the danger of religious comfort, words that floated above reality like incense while suffering stayed on the floor. He prayed with the man anyway. He prayed because prayer mattered. Because it did something, even if it didn't always do what people wanted. But when he stepped back outside, the sun hit his face like a slap, and he realized he could not keep offering heaven as if it excused hell on earth. That was the beginning of the fracture. Not a crisis of belief. A crisis of scale. Because Leo believed the gospel was true. He believed redemption was real. But he also began to see how easily redemption could be shrunk, packaged as private relief, a spiritual escape hatch, while everything public and brutal and unjust remained untouched. And if the Church could speak so convincingly about eternity while staying quiet about hunger, what else had it learned to ignore? Peru made him fluent in realities Rome rarely had to smell. It taught him that sin wasn't only personal weakness, it was also systems. It was who ate and who didn't. Who had clean water and who had to choose between thirst and sickness. Who could bribe an official and who couldn't afford to be seen. He didn't become a politician. He became something more unsettling to institutions, a priest who took the world literally. Years later, Chicago tested that same conviction in a different fire. The streets were not dust but asphalt. The poverty didn't wear the same face, but it carried the same weight. He arrived in a city where churches stood within sight of boarded windows, where Sunday voices rose in worship while Monday sirens cut through the morning. Here, suffering came with paperwork. It came with zoning decisions and school districts and court dates. It came with the quiet, constant pressure of being judged before you spoke. It came with people who had learned to keep their heads down because lifting them brought consequences. Leo was assigned to a parish that was considered difficult, which in church language often meant ignored until it became embarrassing. He met mothers who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't keep the heat on. He met teenagers who spoke about the future like it was a rumor. He met men who had done time and wanted to be seen as more than their worst day. He met families who sat in the same pews for generations and still felt invisible to the city that used their neighborhoods as talking points. One winter evening, after a community meeting that ended in raised voices and slammed doors, Leo stayed behind to help stack chairs. A deacon, tired, blunt, good-hearted, looked at him and said, "Father, they keep asking us to preach hope. But they mean quiet. They mean don't make trouble. That sentence followed Leo for weeks. Don't make trouble. As if the gospel had ever been polite. He began to see the pattern with painful clarity. The church could become skilled at consoling people without confronting what crushed them. Skilled at encouraging patience while injustice learned patience too, patience in getting away with it. Leo didn't abandon prayer. He deepened it. But his prayer started to feel like it had sharp edges. The more he read the words of Christ, the harder it became to separate faith from consequences. I'm hungry. The thirsty. The stranger. The sick. The imprisoned. Not metaphors. People. And the terrifying implication beneath it all, if the church preached a redemption that didn't touch those realities, then it wasn't just incomplete, it was dangerously convenient. That conviction made him respected in some circles and quietly unwelcome in others. Rome called him not because it wanted his fire, but because it believed it could contain it, give him committees, give him diplomacy, give him the slow machinery of deliberation that turns urgency into paperwork. At first, he tried to work within it. He learned the language of Vatican meetings, careful phrases, soft disagreements, concerns expressed as questions. He sat in rooms where men spoke about global suffering as if it were a concept rather than a wound. He watched how easily the institution protected itself, how unity could become a weapon used against truth. And he also saw something else, not malice, but fear. Fear that if the church admitted it had minimized redemption, people would ask what else had been minimized. Fear that the moment the gospel expanded, the church would lose control of it. In those years, Leo's life narrowed in one way and widened in another. His days became filled with documents, but his nights filled with faces he couldn't forget, the old man in Peru asking where salvation happens, the mother in Chicago standing in a food pantry line with pride clenched like a fist, the deacon saying hope had become a synonym for silence. It was never one dramatic revelation. It was an accumulation, like water behind a dam. Then came the papacy. The world saw a new pope and started projecting whatever it wanted onto him: reformer, traditionalist, compromise candidate, surprise choice. For the first few months, Leo spoke carefully. He met leaders. He smiled for the cameras. He handled crises with a measured calm that reassured the faithful and soothed the nervous. But inside him, the dam did not disappear. It was held. And it held. And then, 6 months in the dark hours when even Rome seems to whisper, he decided he was done letting redemption be preached like a private comfort while the world burned publicly. That is why the phrase came out the way it did. Not misunderstood. Not misapplied. Not in need of clarification. False. A word heavy enough to offend, heavy enough to wake the sleeping parts of the church, heavy enough to force a choice. Back in the Vatican, dawn was now fully awake, and Leo stood at his window like a man watching the tide before it turns violent. Below, the square filled with people who still believed the church could keep their faith safe. Behind him, footsteps approached, careful, rehearsed, carrying urgency in a controlled disguise. Monsignor Vigano entered and swallowed before speaking. Holy Father, Cardinal Ravasi is here. Leo didn't turn immediately. He looked down one last time at the crowd, as if memorizing faces he might soon lose, not from hatred, but from confusion. Then he finally spoke, measured and final. "Show him in." Cardinal Ravasi entered with the careful posture of a man stepping onto thin ice. He wore composure the way Romans wore tailored black, precise, traditional, meant to signal control. But his eyes gave him away. They moved once, quickly, to the folder on Leo's desk, then to the Pope's face, as if measuring the distance between the two and calculating whether anyone could survive what was about to be said aloud. Leo didn't offer him the long courtesies of rank. No elaborate greeting. No softening introduction. He simply gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. Ravasi sat, but not fully. His spine stayed upright, braced. For a moment, neither spoke. In the silence, the Vatican seemed to lean in. Then Leo did something that tightened the air even more. He called him by his first name. Gianfranco. It wasn't familiarity. It was intent. "This isn't theater," it said. "This is not a meeting between offices. This is a conversation between men who will answer for what they do." Ravasi swallowed once. "Holy Father." Leo lifted a hand, gently. Not to dismiss him, but to focus him. "You've seen the language." "I have," Ravasi said. "And I'm here because I must beg you to reconsider the framing, if not the substance." "The framing is the substance." Ravasi's fingers tightened around his own knee, the smallest betrayal of nerves. "You understand what this will be taken as. Not an expansion, an accusation. The word false, it will be heard as condemnation." "It is condemnation," Leo replied, calm as a physician naming a disease. "Of the gospel?" No, Leo's voice hardened, almost imperceptibly. "Of what we have done to it." Ravasi took a breath and tried another angle, the Vatican's native language of delay. "Then let there be consultation. Let the bishops be prepared. Let the dicasteries weigh the implications. Let us." "Consultation is over," Leo said. The sentence landed with finality, like a lock turning. Ravasi's eyes narrowed. "Holy Father, with respect, the Church does not move by sudden declarations. It moves by discernment." "I have discerned," Leo said. "For decades." Ravasi hesitated, then spoke the fear underneath the procedural concerns. "They will say you are dividing the Church." "They will say whatever protects them," Leo replied. "I am not dividing the Church. I am naming the division that already exists between what we preach and what we permit." Ravasi's voice softened. "Then at least remove the word. Say incomplete. Say misunderstood. Say." Leo leaned forward slightly. In that simple motion, power shifted. "No," he said, quiet but unyielding. "We have allowed people to treat salvation like a private ticket out of the world. We have preached redemption in a way that lets the comfortable remain comfortable. We have called it faith when it was escape. That is not merely incomplete. It is false. Ravasi's face tightened, pained now, not only worried. You will be accused of politicizing the gospel. Leo held his gaze. The gospel was never apolitical. We made it that way so we could bless the status quo without getting our hands dirty. Ravasi looked down, briefly, as if searching for a language that could save both truth and institution. When he looked back up, his voice had the tone of a man appealing to a friend rather than a monarch. Holiness, if you do this as written, there will be containment measures. There will be meetings without you. There will be documents drafted to correct you. Leo nodded as if Ravasi had simply described weather. I know. And Van Rossum will move. At the name, something subtle moved in Leo's eyes, not surprise, not fear. Recognition. Yes, Leo said. He will. Ravasi stood slowly, as if standing could change the conversation. It did not. Then I ask you one last time. Delay. 1 week. 1 month. Give us time to prepare the church for the shock. Leo's answer was almost tender, and that tenderness made it more devastating. The shock is the point, he said. Sleep has been killing us. Ravasi bowed, a fraction deeper than required, and turned to leave. At the door, he paused, the slightest tremor in his voice. May God protect you, Holy Father. Leo didn't respond immediately. Then, softly, may he protect the people. They will bear the consequences first. Ravasi left. For a breath, the Vatican held its silence again. Then it broke. It started with light. One by one, offices on the upper floor snapped awake, yellow rectangles in the pre-dawn gloom, like watchmen posted along the stone. Doors opened. Shoes hurried across ancient tile. A printer whined somewhere behind a wall. A fax machine, still stubbornly alive in the Vatican's labyrinth, began its harsh mechanical song. Phones rang like alarms. Not in one place, but everywhere. A call from Rome to Madrid. From Rome to Lagos. From Rome to Sao Paulo. From Rome to Manila. The church had arteries across the world, and something had entered the bloodstream. Word had not yet gone public, not officially. But in the Vatican, nothing stayed private for long. A secretary heard a phrase. A Monsignor repeated it in a hushed corridor. A translator caught a draft line and felt his stomach drop. A cardinal's aide texted a colleague with 2 words and a warning, false redemption. By sunrise, the Vatican wasn't a city-state anymore. It was a living organism in a stress response, everything tightening, everything mobilizing, as if the institution had its own nervous system and it had just detected pain. In a suite of offices far from Leo's chambers, Cardinal William Van Rossum sat under a lamp that made his face look carved rather than aged. He was not a dramatic man. He didn't rage in public. He didn't throw objects or shout. His authority came from stillness, the kind that made younger clergy speak more carefully around him. They called him the guardian of orthodoxy, though he would have insisted he was only a servant of truth. When his aide delivered the news, Van Rossum didn't ask if it was accurate. He asked only, who confirmed it? 2 sources, the aide said. One from the Secretariat, one from. Van Rossum raised a hand. That was enough. He looked down at the brief notes, and his eyes moved over the words like a judge reading a sentence. The Church has been preaching a false redemption. His jaw set, not in anger, but in resolve. His fear was not that faith would collapse. Faith endured storms. Faith survived tyrants, wars, plagues, the slow decay of civilizations. Van Rossum feared something more fragile than belief. He feared authority dissolving. Not because he loved power for its own sake, but because he believed the Church was a vessel, and vessels require structure. If you cracked the hull, you didn't only let in fresh air, you invited the sea. And Leo, in Van Rossum's mind, had not simply raised a theological point. He had committed a procedural betrayal. He had bypassed the slow, cautious machinery that made the Church what it was: committees, consultations, layers of consensus. He had moved too quickly, too publicly, too personally. It was as if a captain had decided to steer by instinct and called it courage. Van Rossum picked up the phone and began making calls. Not emotional calls. Strategic ones. He spoke to allies across continents with the calm language of containment. We need to be prepared, he said. We must protect the faithful from confusion. What exactly is he planning to say? Van Rossum's pause carried weight. Enough to be misunderstood on purpose. In another call, he's forcing a binary. We cannot allow the Church to be dragged into spectacle. In another, we will need a response drafted before the cameras turn on. He wasn't organizing a coup. He would have called it stewardship. But stewardship, in Rome, often wore the same clothing as revolt. And then, inevitably, the phrase escaped the walls. It happened the way modern wildfires begin, not with a single blaze, but with sparks carried farther than anyone intended. A reporter in Rome received a whisper from a reliable clerical source. A Vatican watcher posted a cryptic note online. A leak, half accurate, half sensational, hit a newsroom in Milan. An editor, hungry for something that could cut through a slow news week, placed it on a homepage with a headline designed to wound. By noon, the world had a simplified version of Leo's words. Pope declares Church preaching false redemption. Within an hour, the phrase had become a weapon in hands that didn't know what it was. Commentators used it to praise him as revolutionary. Others used it to condemn him as heretic. The faithful used it to argue with their own families. The indifferent used it to mock. The angry used it to recruit. The theology that had taken Leo decades to form was reduced to a slogan. Seminaries erupted. Students debated in hallways, suddenly louder than usual, as if volume could substitute for certainty. Professors were asked to take sides. Priests were cornered after Mass by parishioners who demanded to know if they should still trust the Church. In universities, panels were scheduled overnight, Is the Pope redefining salvation? As if the Internet's appetite required constant feeding. Faith became spectacle. And the most painful truth of spectacle is this: once your words are public, they no longer belong to you. They belong to whoever can shout them best. In the Apostolic Palace, Leo watched the chaos arrive without flinching. Monsignor Vigano returned with an armful of briefings, eyes wide, voice tight. "Holiness, the headlines." "I've seen them," Leo said. "They're saying you deny salvation. That you deny the cross." Leo's gaze remained steady. "They were going to say that no matter what I wrote. It is easier than listening. And Van Rossum is mobilizing," Vigano added, carefully, as if naming him could summon him. "I expected it," Leo said. Vigano hesitated. "Then, what do we do?" Leo stood, went to the window again. The square below was fuller now. The world looked the same, which was always the strange thing about historic moments. The buildings don't shake when the future shifts. People still buy coffee. Birds still circle the dome. The sun still rises. What we do, Leo said, is refuse to give them a war. Vigano blinked. "Holiness." Leo turned back to him. "They want clean camps. They want enemies. They want supporters to cheer and opponents to sharpen knives. That is the easiest story to tell." He walked to his desk and touched the folder once, not like a man clinging to it, but like a man anchoring himself. "We will not give them that story." Within the hour, orders moved through the Vatican that confused almost everyone. Leo insisted that critics be present beside supporters at the press conference. He refused to publish a list of approved theologians. He refused to silence dissenting cardinals. In fact, he invited them closer. Some aides argued it would make him look weak. Some said it was reckless. Some said it was naive. Leo listened, then shook his head. "It is not unity if it is manufactured," he said. "And it is not truth if it requires censorship to survive." The demand baffled Van Rossum's circle. It even unsettled the Pope's allies. People were accustomed to papal authority as a lever, pull it, and the institution moved. Leo was treating authority like an invitation to conscience rather than a command. It infuriated those who wanted him to declare a side and crush the other. But Leo's strategy had a sharper edge than it appeared. If he refused polarization, he forced everyone else to reveal whether their resistance was truly doctrinal or simply fear of losing comfort and control. Late afternoon, while meetings multiplied and cameras were arranged and talking points were drafted like shields, Leo did something that did not appear on any schedule. He left. No procession. No press. No announcement. Only a simple car, an unmarked route, and a small security detail sworn to silence. In Rome, there are places where suffering is hidden in plain sight. The tourist sees fountains and ruins. The pilgrim sees basilicas. But behind the beautiful facades, the city holds its displaced, its exhausted, its forgotten. The refugee center sat in a converted building that smelled of boiled lentils, damp coats, and too many people sharing too little space. The air carried layers of human presence, soap, sweat, disinfectant, old fear. When Leo entered, the room didn't immediately recognize him. That was the point. He wore no regalia. No ring on display. No visible signs of power beyond the posture of a man who had learned to carry responsibility without drama. A volunteer greeted him, startled, then covered her shock with professionalism. "Your father, this way." He walked through narrow corridors lined with donated jackets and children's drawings taped to walls. Cren's sons. Stick figure families. Words in languages the Vatican rarely heard unless they arrived as statistics. He sat with a man who had crossed two borders with nothing but a backpack and a photograph. He listened to a woman describe losing her home, then losing her brother, then losing the idea that anyone in power would ever care. A child climbed onto a chair near him, stared openly, then asked, bluntly, "Are you the Pope?" Leo smiled, small, real. "Yes." The child considered that for a moment, then asked, "Can you fix it?" Leo's throat tightened. He didn't answer with promises. He answered with presence. "I can try," he said. Near evening, in a corner of the center where the noise softened, an older woman approached him. Her hands were rough, nails chipped, fingers stained with work. She didn't bow. She didn't ask for a blessing. She simply held something out. A crude wooden cross. It was made from scraps, uneven, splintered, the grain exposed where it had been carved too quickly. A cross that looked like it had been made with a pocket knife and desperation. "I made it," she said. Her Italian was broken, patched with another language underneath. For remembering. Leo took it carefully. The wood was warm from her hands. "It is not beautiful," she added, almost apologizing. Leo's fingers closed around it, and something in his expression shifted, not softened, but sharpened into clarity. "It is beautiful," he said. "Because it is real." The woman looked at him as if she didn't fully believe anyone in white could speak that way. Then she nodded once, a tiny motion that carried years. "Do not forget us," she said. Leo held the cross a moment longer than necessary, as if memorizing its weight. "I won't," he said. When he returned to the Vatican, night had begun to drape itself over Rome. The marble halls were lit again, not with reverence but with readiness. The air in the palace felt electric, staff moving quickly, voices low, the machinery of the church turning hard. Leo entered his study alone. He placed the wooden cross on his desk beside the official documents waiting for his signature, carefully worded statements, briefing notes, diplomatic considerations, drafts crafted to protect the institution from itself. The cross looked almost out of place, too rough, too honest, too human for the polished world of Rome. But it belonged there. It was, in its own silent way, the entire argument. Leo sat down, stared at it for a long moment, then opened the folder again. Outside, beyond the thick walls, the world argued in headlines and hashtags. Inside, the Vatican braced like a fortress preparing for siege. Tomorrow, words would collide with the world. And this time, the world would not be able to pretend it hadn't heard. Morning arrived without permission. Rome woke the way it always did, coffee machines hissing, scooters slicing through narrow streets, pigeons gathering like stubborn parishioners, but inside the Vatican, the day felt staged for judgment. The air held that peculiar tension of places where history is about to be recorded, not excitement, not fear exactly, but a tightness that makes even ordinary sounds feel too loud. In the Pope's study, the wooden cross sat beside immaculate papers like a witness beside a stack of affidavits. Leo dressed without ceremony. No layered regalia. No elaborate vestments meant to soften authority into beauty. He chose a simple white cassock, unadorned, and when Vigano entered with final notes and last-minute cautions, Leo didn't reach for them. He reached for the cross. Vigano watched, throat working. "Holiness, the press hall is full. They are calling it," he hesitated, as if the word itself could contaminate the room. "A trial." Leo's eyes did not leave the cross. "Then let them see evidence," he said. The Vatican press hall was already packed, lit with harsh studio brightness that made faces look tired and true. Cameras stared from their tripods like silent jurors. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, notebooks ready, fingers poised over keyboards, hungry for a sentence they could turn into fire. The room had the geometry of a courtroom. A raised platform. A central chair. Flags. Microphones. The expectation of a verdict. When the doors opened, the murmuring stopped in uneven waves. People stood. Some out of habit. Some out of awe. Some because they couldn't help it when power entered a room. Pope Leo XIV walked in with no entourage worth calling a display. He moved with the unhurried pace of a man who had already made peace with consequences. In his left hand, visible to everyone, was the crude wooden cross, splintered, imperfect, utterly out of place among polished marble and expensive lenses. A few reporters exchanged glances. That cross was not Vatican. That cross was not safe. Leo Saturday. He looked out over the room, not as an enemy to be managed, but as people to be addressed, sharply, kindly, without flinching. Then he spoke. "The Church has been preaching a false redemption," he said, clearly, without theatrical pause. A redemption reduced to private comfort. A salvation presented as escape from this world rather than healing within it. The reaction wasn't one sound. It was many. A gasp in the first rows. A sharp inhale. The scrape of chairs. The staccato tap of frantic typing. Someone whispered, "He said it," like they hadn't believed he would dare to keep the headline alive in his own mouth. Leo continued, voice steady as stone. "I am not denying the cross. I am not denying personal salvation. I am denying our right to preach a gospel that leaves the wounded outside the sanctuary." A journalist raised a hand immediately, but Leo didn't take questions yet. He wasn't here to spar. He was here to detonate. He opened a folder, thin, but heavy with intent, and lifted a single page as though the words had weight. "Today I release a document titled Redemptio Integra," he said, pronouncing the Latin like a promise. Redemption made whole. The phrase moved through the room like wind through dry grass. He laid the paper down and spoke the heart of it without hiding behind formality. "Redemption is personal," Leo said. "Yes. It reaches the soul. It reconciles the sinner. It saves the lost." He paused, not for drama, but for precision. But redemption is also communal. It touches families, neighborhoods, nations. It confronts the structures that grind the poor into dust. It refuses to separate prayer from justice, worship from mercy, faith from the world that faith is meant to transform. A reporter near the back muttered, half to herself, "He's rewriting the whole thing." Leo heard the spirit of that sentence even if he didn't hear the words. "No," he said, as if answering the room itself. "I am refusing the smaller version." He spoke of systems not as partisan talking points, but as spiritual realities with real victims, exploitative labor, dehumanizing migration policies, environmental ruin that always punished the poor first. He spoke of creation as something entrusted, not consumed. He spoke of complicity without shouting, which made it worse for those who wanted to dismiss him as emotional. "Where the Church is silent in the face of suffering," he said, "it does not remain neutral. Silence is not innocence. Silence becomes permission." That line hit like a slap. Some faces tightened with anger, clergy in collars, commentators already deciding how to frame the story. Some faces softened with relief, the look of people who had been waiting years to hear someone with power speak in a language that matched reality. When Leo finally allowed questions, the room erupted. "Are you calling previous popes false teachers? Are you aligning the Church with political movements? Are you changing doctrine on salvation?" Leo answered without defending his ego. "I am calling us back to the full gospel," he said. "If that embarrasses us, then perhaps we should ask why." He stood to leave, and as he did, cameras zoomed in on the wooden cross in his hand, as if the world sensed that symbol would outlast the headlines. Outside the press hall, Rome was already on fire, digitally, verbally, emotionally. News alerts lit up phones like small explosions. Pope accuses Church of false redemption. Vatican in crisis. Schism fears grow. By afternoon, statements arrived from cardinals with the language of alarm wrapped in polite phrases. Clarification is urgently required. Ambiguity must be corrected. The Holy Father's words risk confusion among the faithful. And then Van Rossum's circle moved openly. A senior cardinal requested an emergency meeting. A coalition drafted a response letter for the good of the Church. Rumors spread of private petitions and whispered votes, of bishops being pressured to publicly distance themselves. Security tightened. Barriers went up. Routes changed. Guards doubled. The Vatican is accustomed to threat, but this was not only physical danger, it was narrative danger. The kind that could shatter an institution from within. And the pilgrims came anyway. They arrived with rosaries and smartphones, with faith and fury braided together. They arrived because history was happening where they could see it, and people cannot resist standing near a moment that might define them. By evening, St. Peter's Square looked like two gatherings forced into the same space. Some held signs that read gospel means action. Others held signs that demanded true Catholic teaching. Some held nothing at all, only expressions that asked, "What are we supposed to do with this?" Inside, Leo was given a prepared text for the next day's public appearance. It was carefully worded, balanced, designed to lower temperature. He read it once. Then he set it aside. Vigano watched him, eyes anxious. "Holiness, this is what the Secretariat recommends." "The crowd is unpredictable." Leo's answer was quiet, and that quiet carried steel. "The crowd is not the danger," he said. "Dishonesty is." The next day, sunlight flooded the square, and cameras from every network hovered like mechanical birds. The basilica loomed, ancient, unshaken, as if it had seen every human storm and learned patience. Leo stepped out. He did not go straight to the balcony. He did not maintain distance. He walked down among the people. A murmur rolled through the crowd like a wave. Some reached out, fingers trembling, trying to touch his sleeve. Others shouted questions. Some shouted accusations. The noise was messy, alive, unfiltered, exactly what institutions fear and what shepherds cannot avoid. Near the front, a man stood holding a sign high above his head. "Stop the false pope." The man's face was red with conviction, the kind that can become cruelty when threatened. When Leo saw him, he stopped. Security moved reflexively, but Leo lifted a hand. Not a command. A request for space. He approached the man until there were only a few feet between them. For a breath, the square held still. Leo looked at the sign, then looked at the man, and his voice, when he spoke, was not angry. It was surgical. When Jesus described judgment, Leo asked, "What did he say we would be judged by?" The man blinked, caught off guard. He expected a rebuke, a performance. Not a question. "We're judged by faith," the man said, defensive. Leo nodded slowly. "Yes. Faith." Then he tilted his head slightly, as if inviting the man to remember the part of Scripture that doesn't fit neatly into slogans. "And how did Jesus describe that faith?" The man hesitated. The crowd leaned in. Leo didn't wait for the man to be crushed by uncertainty. He spoke gently, but the gentleness cut deeper than rage. He said, "I was hungry, and you gave me food. Thirsty, and you gave me drink. A stranger, and you welcomed me. Naked, and you clothed me. Sick, and you visited me. In prison, and you came to me." Matthew 25. The words fell into the square like stones dropped into water, sending ripples through faces. Leo looked back at the man. "If you want true teaching," he said, "then begin there." The man's mouth opened, then closed. He lowered the sign slightly, not in surrender, but in confusion, like a wall had cracked and he didn't know what would spill through. Leo didn't mock him. He didn't humiliate him. He simply turned toward the crowd and spoke without a microphone, forcing people to listen with more than their devices. "I have not denied Christ's sacrifice," Leo said. "I have denied the Church's right to use doctrine as an excuse for indifference." He moved toward the basilica steps and sat down, an image no one expected, a pope seated among stone and sunlight like a parish priest on a front porch. Around him, cardinals stood in a line that looked orderly until you realized it was a fault line. Leo spoke from that place, no grand height, no safe distance. "If redemption is real," he said, "it must be visible. Not only in what we believe, but in what we do. If the Church offers comfort while remaining complicit, then we betray the gospel we claim to protect." For a moment, nothing happened. Then applause began, not thunderous, not unanimous. Just one cluster, then another. A hesitant wave turning into movement. A cardinal near the center rose first. Then another. Then a bishop. Then more. It wasn't coordinated. It wasn't choreographed. That was why it mattered. Like a slow tide, clergy stood, some with faces full of conviction, some with resignation, some with tears they didn't bother hiding. The crowd followed, thousands rising as if their bodies had been waiting for permission to agree with what their conscience already knew. And then the camera found the stillness. Cardinal Van Rossum remained seated. So did those beside him. A row of immovable figures, hands folded, faces set, men who believed they were holding the line, even as the line shifted beneath them. The image was instant history. A church standing. A church resisting. Leo looked at them without hatred. Without triumph. Only with the sadness of a man who knew this was not the end of conflict but the beginning of clarity. That night, the Vatican quieted, not because the storm had passed, but because storms eventually exhaust the lungs that feed them. Leo returned to his study. The wooden cross waited on his desk, rough against the smoothness of everything else. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, felt the splinters press lightly into his skin like a reminder that holiness was not meant to be comfortable. He went to the chapel alone. No cameras. No aids. Just the soft burn of candles and the silence that feels different after you've spoken a truth that cannot be retracted. He knelt. Not relieved. Lighter. As if obedience to conscience, even when it costs, removes a burden you didn't realize you were carrying. When he returned to his desk, he opened a blank page and began to write again, not to retreat, not to soften, but to anchor the storm in something unbreakable. A second document. A follow-up. Words shaped not for headlines but for hands, how parishes could act, how bishops could measure mercy, how faith could become visible in food, shelter, advocacy, repair. Outside, in St. Peter's Square, candles flickered. Small flames in the dark, ordinary people refusing to let the argument stay abstract. Some prayed. Some sang softly. Some simply stood, holding light as if to say, "We heard you. We will try." The controversy was not over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. But the Church had been forced into the open, forced to show, in public and in real time, whether it would preserve a narrow salvation that asked nothing of the world, or face a redemption wide enough to change it. Before you go, kindly subscribe. It helps the channel grow and guarantees you never miss the next release.